The haunting of Widow's Peak, secrets buried in the fog, and the ancient ritual that awoke what should have stayed dormant. It was the fog that first warned them. Widow's Peak had long been a place avoided by the townsfolk, a cliffside where the wind howled through the cracks of long-abandoned homes. At the edge of town, it stood as a silent sentinel, watching over the water below as the tide lapped at the rocky shore. Most people would call it a curse, an omen, but to some, it was simply a place to forget. The town of Glenmere had a history that few remembered, and fewer still cared to speak about. The elders told stories, old wives' tales of a time before the settlers arrived, when the land was ruled by something far darker, far older. It was the fog, they said, that kept the past alive, but it was also the fog that hid the truth, and the truth, when uncovered, was far more terrifying than anyone could have imagined. It began on a moonless night, a night when the fog rolled in thicker than ever. Emma, a young journalist from the city, had heard whispers about Widow's Peak. Fascinated by the mystery, she ventured into the small coastal town, hoping to uncover the long-buried stories that haunted the town's history. She'd heard rumors of a ritual, one conducted centuries ago, that had cursed the land, a pact made in desperation, a price paid in blood. The townsfolk, of course, had no interest in helping her. They were wary of outsiders and spoke little of the past. But Emma was determined. Armed with an old map and the journals of a forgotten historian, she made her way up the rocky path leading to Widow's Peak. The fog wrapped around her like a living thing, thick and suffocating. With each step, the air grew colder, and the hair on the back of her neck stood on end. She reached the top and found the remnants of an old chapel, its stone walls crumbling with age. An eerie silence hung in the air, but it wasn't the silence of an abandoned place. It was the silence of something that had been waiting for her. As she explored the ruins, she found signs of an ancient ritual, worn carvings on the stones and faded symbols on the walls. A circle, a pentagram, etched into the floor, and in the center, a dark stain, the mark of a sacrifice. The historian had written in his notes. Emma's breath caught in her throat. She had found the spot where the ritual had been performed. A voice, soft and broken, echoed through the fog. Emma turned, but there was no one there. "Leave," the voice whispered, barely audible, but unmistakable. "Leave now, before it's too late." Her heart raced. She spun around, her eyes scanning the fog for any sign of life. But there was nothing. The voice had come from nowhere, or had it come from everywhere? The air grew thicker, the fog denser, and the ground beneath her feet seemed to tremble. Then she saw it. From the edge of the cliff, rising from the sea of mist below, something black and twisted emerged, a shadow, shaped like a man but contorted in unnatural ways. Its eyes glowed with an eerie light, and its mouth was twisted into a grotesque grin. The thing reached out to her, its hands long and clawed. Emma froze, paralyzed by terror. She knew, instinctively, that she had awakened something ancient, something that had slumbered for centuries, bound by a pact made in blood. The ritual, it had never been completed, and now, it had returned to finish what was started. The townsfolk had known the truth all along. They had hidden it away, buried it in the fog, because they feared what would happen if the ritual was ever completed. They feared what Emma had just uncovered, the curse of Widow's Peak. Desperately, Emma turned to flee, but the fog enveloped her, blinding her, trapping her in the embrace of the thing from the dark. The air grew colder, and she could feel its breath on her neck, its voice growing louder, more insistent. "Sacrifice," it whispered, its voice now a chorus of many. "Blood must be spilled. You must pay the price." But it was too late. Emma never returned. The next morning, the fog was gone, but the town was no less haunted. The old chapel stood as it always had, a silent testament to the past, and those who dared approach Widow's Peak could still hear the faintest whisper in the wind, the mournful cry of a voice that never escaped the fog. The curse of Widow's Peak had been awakened, and the secrets buried in the mist, long forgotten by time, had risen once more. The haunting of Widow's Peak, secrets buried in the fog, and the ancient ritual that awoke what should have stayed dormant, Part 2. After Emma's disappearance, Glenmere seemed to sink into an uneasy calm. The town, once full of whispers and fear, now hushed even further, as if holding its breath. Yet, not all were content to let the mystery rest. In the weeks that followed, rumors began to circulate, whispers of strange occurrences, of people seeing shadows at the edge of the fog, of dreams that were more like memories, where ancient voices called out in unearthly languages. Lena, a local historian and the granddaughter of the town's oldest surviving resident, had known Emma. She had warned the journalist not to go to Widow's Peak, but the woman had been determined to dig into the past. Now, Lena felt a deep responsibility for the tragedy that had befallen her, and she could not allow the curse to persist any longer. She began to search the town's archives for any forgotten records that might reveal more about the ritual. She found old journals, letters sealed in wax, and fragmented maps. But one document stood out, a worn, leather-bound book, its pages yellowed with age. It was a personal account, written by the very historian Emma had referenced in her notes. It described the origins of the curse, the creation of the ritual, and the entity it sought to control. The ritual, according to the book, had been created long before the town of Glenmere was founded. The land had been inhabited by an ancient tribe that practiced a forbidden form of magic. They had learned to summon and bind dark forces from beyond the veil, but their ambition had grown too great. In a desperate attempt to gain immortality, they had called forth an entity from the void, a creature of unimaginable power that feasted on souls and minds alike. But as the entity's power grew, so too did its hunger. Fearing that they had lost control, the tribe's high priestess led a ritual to bind the creature forever, trapping it in the depths of the fog, beneath the cliffs of Widow's Peak. To do so, she had made a sacrifice, her own blood, her own life, and in return, the entity's power was sealed, dormant, until the time was right. Lena stared at the page, her mind racing. The priestess's blood had bound the creature, but the binding was fragile, like the thread of a spider's web. Time had frayed it. The fog, that eternal blanket, was what had kept the creature in slumber, but the ritual had never been fully completed. Emma's arrival, the disturbance of the long-forgotten sight, had acted as a trigger, unleashing what should have stayed dormant. Determined to stop the curse, Lena knew that the only way to end the entity's reign of terror was to finish the ritual. But how? The high priestess's blood had been sacrificed long ago. The only way to reverse the curse was to find another willing soul, someone with the same resolve to give everything for the greater good. As Lena pondered the implications of the book's revelation, a sudden chill swept through the room. The fog, which had been absent for days, rolled in once again, thick and dense, swirling around the town. She knew, without a doubt, that something terrible was on the verge of happening. Outside, the wind picked up, howling through the narrow streets. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in the distance. It was a sound too deliberate to be the wind. Lena stepped outside and saw a figure standing at the edge of Widow's Peak, silhouetted against the moonlit sky. It was a woman, dressed in old-fashioned attire, her face hidden in shadow. The figure seemed to be waiting for something, or someone. Lena's breath caught in her throat as she realized the truth. It was Emma. The fog parted briefly, and for a moment, Lena could see Emma's face pale, hollow, her eyes wide with terror. But it wasn't Emma anymore. The woman had become a vessel for something else. The entity had taken her, twisted her soul, and now she was a servant to its will. "Help me," Emma's voice whispered through the fog. But it was not her voice. It was an amalgamation of countless voices, distorted and ancient. "Finish the ritual. Set me free." Lena's heart raced as the entity's gaze locked with hers, burning with an unholy intensity. She knew that Emma had not truly been the victim, she had been the key, the sacrifice needed to complete the ritual. But Lena wasn't sure she could do it. Could she really perform the ritual, knowing it might cost her everything? Could she give up her own life and blood to put the creature back in the void? The air grew colder, and the fog thickened, crawling like a living thing. The entity's presence was suffocating, and Lena could feel the weight of its power pressing down on her chest. The town was at the mercy of the creature once again. A distant bell tolled, signaling midnight. Lena realized that the time was now. If she hesitated for even a moment longer, the town would be lost forever. With trembling hands, she opened the ancient book, reciting the incantation in a language she had never spoken before. The words filled the air, growing louder and more forceful with every syllable. The earth beneath her feet trembled, and the wind howled as the creature began to stir. Emma's form began to disintegrate, the dark shape within her body breaking free. It was a thing of darkness, twisted and formless, its eyes burning with an ancient rage. The ritual had to be completed, or else the town would become its next feast. Lena's voice faltered as the final words left her lips. Time seemed to stretch, the world around her dissolving into darkness. The creature let out a deafening roar, but just as it lunged toward her, the air split open with a blinding light. And then, silence. When the fog finally cleared, Lena stood alone at the edge of Widow's Peak. The town of Glenmere was eerily still. The creature was gone, but the cost had been great. The ritual had been completed, but it had taken Lena's soul as its price. She had saved the town, but she had also become part of the darkness she had sought to banish. And as the fog rolled in once again, the people of Glenmere would whisper her name, for they knew that some secrets were better left buried, and that the past was never truly gone. It only waited for the right moment to rise again. The haunting of Widow's Peak, secrets buried in the fog, and the ancient ritual that awoke what should have stayed dormant, Part 3. Years passed, and Glenmere began to move on, as towns often do when the darkness fades, or at least when the people convince themselves it has. The town prospered quietly, its docks filled with ships once more, its streets bustling with tourists who had no memory of the strange events that had once plagued the town. The fog, however, never quite left. It rolled in more often than not, creeping down from Widow's Peak, though no one seemed to think much of it anymore. But deep within the woods and along the cliffs, the land held its secrets, buried just beneath the surface, the fog a reminder that the past was never truly gone. It simply waited. The legend of Widow's Peak was fading, becoming little more than an old folk tale, a whispered warning to travelers who came too close to the cliffs. But one night, on the eve of the full moon, something stirred. The first sign was subtle. The town's children, who had never heard the stories, began to speak of strange dreams. They whispered of a woman in the fog, her face pale and empty, her voice distant, but filled with a terrible urgency. The townsfolk dismissed it as mere imagination, but there was an undercurrent of unease, a tension in the air that no one could explain. Then, the disappearances began. First, it was a fisherman, old Mark, who had lived in Glenmere his whole life, vanished without a trace one evening. His boat found adrift in the harbor. There was no sign of struggle, no sign of anything unusual, just gone. The town searched for days, but there was nothing. The fog rolled in that night, thick and unyielding. Then came Rachel, the local schoolteacher. She'd been seen walking toward Widow's Peak one evening, her head lowered as if in thought. The next morning, her purse was found by the cliffs, but she was nowhere to be seen, and as before, the fog had swallowed the night, leaving no trace of her disappearance. By the time the third person disappeared, the town was on edge. It was no longer just an odd coincidence, something was wrong, and though they had long forgotten the tale of the ritual, they could not deny the chilling sense that something ancient, something dark, was slowly awakening once again. Lena's sacrifice, the completion of the ritual, had been meant to stop the entity, but something had gone wrong. The entity had been bound, but perhaps it had never been fully sealed. It had fed, and it had waited, and now, it was rising again, feeding on the very town that had sought to forget it. This time, there was no one left who could finish what had been started. No one knew the incantation, no one had the knowledge, and worst of all, no one remembered the price of awakening the past. But there was one who had heard the whispers in the fog, one who had studied the old texts and long wondered what had truly happened to Lena. Her name was Thomasina, an archaeologist and distant relative of Lena's, who had come to Glenmere hoping to trace her family's history. When the disappearances began, Thomasina knew that something was wrong. Her grandmother had spoken of Lena in hushed tones, calling her a hero, though the town had always seen her as a mere sacrifice. The truth, Thomasina suspected, was far darker. She spent her days in the library, combing through Lena's journals, the ancient tomes, and anything that might reveal the hidden truth about the curse that still clung to Widow's Peak. And in those dusty pages, she found it. The entity was not gone. It had been wounded, but never destroyed. It had been sealed in the fog, its power diminished but not erased. And if the ritual were to be undone, the cycle would repeat. The entity would rise again, stronger than ever. Thomasina knew that she was the only one who could stop it. The fog had grown denser with each passing day, and the town was starting to panic. Strange occurrences had been happening, doors slamming shut without cause, lights flickering in the dead of night, shadows moving at the corner of people's vision. It was clear that the creature was gathering strength, feeding off the fear and confusion. The final straw came when Thomasina saw the woman in the fog, not as a figure, but as a reflection in the glass of a forgotten window. The face was no longer pale and empty, but twisted, distorted by the entity's influence. It was Lena, or what was left of her. Lena's spirit had not been freed by the ritual. The entity had claimed her, twisted her into its herald, and now, it was reaching out, drawing in the souls of the living, one by one. Emma, too, had been turned into something else, a part of the creature's eternal hunger. Thomasina could feel the weight of their eyes upon her, the pressure growing as the creature called to her. She had to act, but this time, the ritual had to be different. She could not repeat Lena's mistake, nor could she risk sacrificing herself. The town had already paid enough. With no time to waste, Thomasina made her way toward Widow's Peak. The fog swirled around her, thick and suffocating. She knew that when she reached the chapel's ruins, she would be forced to face the thing that had haunted her family for generations. She had only one choice: to rewrite the ritual. The incantation had to be altered, redefined to banish the entity for good. She had learned enough from the ancient texts to know that the ritual had to be performed under the same moon that had once seen the original ceremony. And she had to offer something far more precious than blood. She had to offer the heart of the land itself, the very soul of Widow's Peak. It would mean not only facing the creature but surrendering the town's connection to the land, severing its bond to the past forever. But as she reached the chapel's ruins, the air seemed to pulse with an energy that threatened to consume her. The fog parted, and there, standing in the center of the circle, was Lena, or what had once been Lena. Her eyes glowed with an unnatural light, and she spoke in a voice that was not her own. "Finish what was started," Lena whispered, her voice echoing with the sound of 1,000 souls, "or we all perish." Thomasina closed her eyes, heart heavy with the weight of the decision. The fog parted one last time, and the ritual began anew, the words flowing from her lips. The earth trembled, the air crackled with energy, and the creature roared, its rage filling the night. And then, with a final cry, the land went still. When the fog cleared once more, Thomasina stood alone, her hands trembling. But the silence in the air was different, no longer filled with the presence of the entity. The curse had been broken. But Glenmere, and its people, would never be the same. For the fog still lingered, the memories of the past still buried beneath the surface, waiting for the day when they would rise again. And Widow's Peak? It stood silent, watching, waiting. Because some things never stay buried. The haunting of Widow's Peak, secrets buried in the fog, and the ancient ritual that awoke what should have stayed dormant. Part 4. The dawn that followed Thomasina's victory was gray and cold, like the first breath after a long-held sigh. The fog that had rolled in so thick for decades began to dissipate, leaving behind a silence that was heavy, as though the world itself was listening. For a brief moment, the people of Glenmere thought it was over, that the curse had finally been broken, that the entity was gone. But Thomasina knew better. Her victory had come at a price. The entity, though banished, had left its mark upon the town, and the scars were not easily healed. The land felt different now, hollow in places, as though a part of it had been severed, a connection to the ancient past that had been forever lost. And though the fog cleared from the town, it remained persistent at Widow's Peak. It never truly dissipated, not completely, as if the land itself was in mourning for something that had been stolen from it. In the days following the ritual, the town seemed to breathe easier. The strange occurrences that had plagued Glenmere for years lessened, and people began to return to their everyday lives. The disappearances stopped, the restless dreams faded, and the whispers of the past grew faint. But Thomasina could not shake the feeling that something still lingered in the shadows. One evening, as she sat by the window of the small cottage she had rented in the heart of Glenmere, Thomasina felt the pull once more. The fog had rolled back in, thicker than it had ever been before. It filled the streets, winding its way through the houses, curling around the trees and stones. But this time, it was different. It wasn't just the fog of Widow's Peak. It was something else, something darker, that seemed to seep from the ground itself, stretching far and wide. She stood, heart racing, and rushed outside. The chill in the air was biting, and the fog clung to her skin like a wet shroud. She made her way toward the cliffs, the place she knew she had to go. The fog parted slightly as she approached Widow's Peak, revealing the remnants of the chapel where the ritual had taken place. But this time, the ruins were not empty. There, standing in the center of the ancient circle, was a figure. At first, Thomasina thought it was a figment of her imagination, a trick of the fog, a shadow cast by the trees. But no, this figure was real, and it was watching her. The woman in the fog. The figure turned slowly, her face obscured by a veil of mist, but Thomasina knew at once who she was. It was Lena, or what had once been Lena. Her body was no longer flesh and blood but a pale, translucent thing, made of fog and whispers. Her eyes, glowing faintly in the dark, held a sorrow that pierced Thomasina's heart. "You should not have done it," Lena's voice whispered, but it was not her voice anymore. It was the entity's, twisting through her like a snake. Thomasina's breath caught in her throat. "I had no choice. I had to stop it." Lena, or the thing that had once been Lena, tilted its head, a sad smile playing on its lips. "And now you've taken my place. You have freed the land. Yes, but you have also released something worse. A part of me is still here, tied to the fog, tied to Widow's Peak, and now, you are bound to it too." The air grew colder, the fog thicker, swirling around Thomasina's feet, wrapping around her like a vice. She stumbled back, panic surging in her chest. The ritual had been completed, hadn't it? The entity was gone. The curse was broken. But something wasn't right. The ground trembled beneath her, and the air grew heavy. She felt the unmistakable presence of something stirring beneath the earth. The creature had not been destroyed. It had merely been dormant. The ritual had weakened its hold, but it had never been truly sealed. And now, with the breaking of the ritual's final words, it had awakened once more, not as a single entity, but as a force that had seeped into the very land, into the people of Glenmere, into Thomasina herself. "You are the last piece of the puzzle, Thomasina," the voice whispered, still intertwined with Lena's. "You've taken the place of the one who sacrificed herself. But you have done more than that. You have become part of it, part of the fog, part of the curse." A cold realization gripped Thomasina's heart. The fog, the entity, it had never been bound to one person. It was tied to the land, to the very essence of Widow's Peak. The entity had fed on Lena's sacrifice, and now, it was feeding on her. She turned to run, to escape, but the fog seemed to pull her back, an invisible force drawing her toward the center of the circle. The ruins of the chapel, the ancient stones, now felt alive with energy, dark and hungry. "You cannot run from what is in the blood, from what is in the land," the voice murmured. "The curse is eternal." And just as Thomasina felt the grip of the fog tighten around her, the ground beneath her feet split open with a violent crack. A surge of power erupted from the earth, sending her sprawling to the ground. The wind howled, the fog thickened, and the world around her seemed to warp and shift, as though reality itself was breaking apart. She could hear voices, whispers of long-dead souls, of people lost to the curse of Widow's Peak. But one voice rose above the rest, and this time, it was not Lena's or the entity's. It was her own. The realization hit her like a wave. The fog, the entity, had always been tied to Widow's Peak. It was not something that could be destroyed, nor sealed away. It had lived within the land for as long as the land had existed. And now, as the last person bound to its curse, Thomasina knew what she had to do. The ritual had failed because it could never be completed without one final sacrifice, the sacrifice of the land itself. With trembling hands, she reached out, her fingers brushing the cold stone of the chapel's altar. She could feel the pulse of the land, the heartbeat of Widow's Peak, coursing through her veins. The fog thickened, the wind howled, and the earth trembled beneath her. And with a single, desperate cry, Thomasina called out the final incantation. This time, there would be no binding, no breaking of the curse. This time, the land would be freed. The fog exploded outward, and in an instant, Widow's Peak was no more. The next morning, the town of Glenmere woke to a sky as clear as it had ever been. The fog, the curse, the haunting presence of Widow's Peak, all were gone. The people of Glenmere would never speak of it again, for there were some memories that were best forgotten. But far from the town, high above the cliffs where Widow's Peak had once stood, there was an empty space, a void where the land had once been. And deep within that emptiness, The whispers of the past still lingered, waiting for the day when the fog would rise again. The haunting of Widow's Peak, secrets buried in the fog, and the ancient ritual that awoke what should have stayed dormant, Part 5. Years passed, and the town of Glenmere settled into a new normal. The fog that had once clung to Widow's Peak had not returned, and the land around it seemed to heal, the scars of the past slowly fading beneath the cover of new growth. People came and went, but the town's history, the whispers of the curse, faded into the background, a ghost story, something to tell around campfires or at Halloween parties. But for those who had lived through it, the memories were not so easily forgotten. Thomasina, too, had disappeared from the town. The last time anyone had seen her, she was standing at the edge of the cliff, looking down into the empty expanse where Widow's Peak had once stood. The town had assumed that she, like so many others before her, had simply disappeared into the fog. There was no sign of her after that night. Her cottage was left abandoned, her belongings untouched, as though she had just vanished into thin air. But what no one knew, what they would never know, was that Thomasina had succeeded in her final, desperate act. The entity, the curse, the fog, they were gone. Yes, but at what cost? In the moment when she made her final, earth-shattering sacrifice, she became something else. She became part of the land, part of the very essence of Widow's Peak. In her selfless act, she had freed the town, but in doing so, she had bound herself to the land for eternity. She could never truly leave. It was late one autumn evening, when the first cold winds of winter began to creep in, that the first signs of her return appeared. A young couple had moved into Thomasina's cottage, unaware of the house's history. They were eager to make a life for themselves, to settle into the peaceful rhythm of a small town. But strange things began to happen almost immediately. The couple, Anne and Richard, woke to the sound of footsteps at night, slow, deliberate, as if someone was walking through the house, pacing back and forth. At first, they assumed it was the house settling or the wind rattling the windows. But then, one night, and woke to find the front door wide open, the cold air rushing in, and footsteps in the dust of the old wooden floors, leading toward the cliffs. It was when Anne saw the figure in the fog that things took a darker turn. She had been walking alone toward the cliffs one evening, as dusk settled over the town. When the fog rolled in thick and fast, she didn't notice it at first. But as she reached the edge of the old chapel ruins, she felt it, the same chill that had haunted the town for so long. And then, through the mist, she saw her. A woman, standing at the center of the ruins, her silhouette bathed in the eerie, cold glow of the fog. The woman was looking at the ground, her face obscured, but Anne could feel her presence, could feel the weight of something ancient and heavy in the air. "Are you lost?" Anne had asked, her voice trembling despite her best efforts. The woman did not answer, but slowly lifted her head, her eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Anne froze. It was Thomasina's face, pale, lifeless, eyes glowing with an unnatural light, and in that instant, Anne realized that the woman in front of her was not fully human. She was part of something else, part of the land, part of the fog. Thomasina was no longer a person. She was a spirit, bound to the place, to the very air and earth that had once been cursed. Before Anne could speak, the figure vanished into the fog, leaving only a lingering chill in the air. Frightened, Anne returned to the cottage, but things only grew worse. The couple began to hear whispers, soft murmurs that seemed to come from nowhere, from within the walls of the house, from the very ground beneath their feet. At night, the fog would roll in without warning, thick and oppressive, curling through the trees and the streets, suffocating the town in its weight. One evening, Richard ventured out to the cliffs alone, hoping to find some answers, to understand what was happening. As he reached the ruins of the chapel, he felt a presence behind him, a whisper in the air. "Leave," it said, its voice low and urgent. "Leave this place. It's not for you." Richard turned, but saw nothing. The fog swallowed the night, and the wind howled as though trying to warn him. He made his way back to the town, but the unease stayed with him. That night, as Anne sat alone in the cottage, she felt a strange sensation. The air grew heavy, oppressive, and she could hear the unmistakable sound of footsteps again, pacing up and down the hall. She stood, heart racing, and walked toward the sound. As she opened the door to the study, she gasped. There, standing by the window, was Thomasina, or what had become of her. Her once vibrant eyes were now lifeless orbs, glowing faintly in the dim light. Her skin was pale, translucent, like a ghost, and she was staring out the window, her hands pressed against the glass, as if looking for something or someone. "You shouldn't be here," Anne whispered, her voice barely audible. Thomasina turned slowly, her face expressionless, and then, in a voice that echoed with 1,000 lost souls, she spoke. "You should not have come. The land has already taken its toll. The fog never truly leaves. It calls for all who trespass." And stumbled back, terrified. "What do you want from us?" But Thomasina did not answer. She simply pointed toward the cliffs, and the fog thickened, swirling outside the window like a living thing. The house trembled as the ground began to shake, the earth beneath Glenmere groaning as if waking from a deep slumber. The fog was returning, and with it, the curse. But this time, it was no longer bound to Widow's Peak. It had spread beyond, creeping into the town, into the lives of everyone who had once thought they were safe. It had been reborn, stronger than ever, feeding on the fear and uncertainty left in the wake of Thomasina's sacrifice. And Richard fled that night, leaving Glenmere behind. The house, the town, and the land were left to their own devices, bound by the ancient forces that had been unleashed so long ago. And as they left, they looked back at the town, and for the first time in years, they saw the fog again, thicker and darker than ever. It was rolling in from the cliffs, swallowing the town whole. The curse of Widow's Peak had never truly been broken. It had only been waiting. As the years continued to pass, Glenmere was forgotten by most, its name fading from maps and history books. But for those who still remembered, the fog remained a warning, a reminder that some secrets, some curses, are not meant to be broken, and some rituals, once begun, are never truly finished. Widow's Peak stood silent, watching, waiting. Because some things never die. They only sleep. The haunting of Widow's Peak, secrets buried in the fog, and the ancient ritual that awoke what should have stayed dormant, Part 6. Glenmere had been forgotten by many, lost to the whispers of time and the thick fog that swallowed its streets. For decades, the town had stood on the edge of memory, and the people who once lived there, their names and stories, faded into the annals of history. But what remained, what had always remained, was the land itself, and the curse that clung to it like a shadow. A shadow that would never truly disappear. It was a dark, stormy night when the first group of outsiders came to Glenmere after its long years of silence. A team of historians, archaeologists, and paranormal researchers had heard the rumors, heard the stories of the strange disappearances, the haunted town, and the curse of Widow's Peak. They had come to investigate, to uncover the truth behind the fog, and to see if the stories were just that, stories. But those who ventured too close to the town's heart were never seen again. There were 4 of them, and their names are now forgotten by most. They were young, eager, driven by curiosity and the thrill of uncovering the supernatural. The town had long since been abandoned, and the buildings were little more than decaying remnants of what had once been a thriving port town. They set up camp just outside the town's borders, near the cliffs, determined to delve into the heart of Glenmere's dark past. Their leader, Dr. Evelyn Cross, was an archaeologist with a reputation for fearless exploration. She had read about Thomasina and the ancient ritual, and she knew that Glenmere held a key to something far larger than just a local legend. She believed there was a hidden truth in the land, something powerful, something that had been buried for centuries. It wasn't long before they felt the first signs of the town's lingering presence. At night, the wind howled unnaturally, carrying with it whispers that made no sense. The fog rolled in thick, coiling through their camp like a living thing, and each morning, they found their equipment moved, their notes scattered, as if unseen hands were watching them. Dr. Cross, determined as ever, pressed on. Despite the growing sense of unease among her team, she believed the answers were close, that Widow's Peak and its history held the key to unlocking a forgotten part of the world's past. But as the days wore on, the fog grew thicker, and the whispers grew louder. One night, just before dawn, Dr. Cross stood alone on the edge of the cliffs, staring into the mist. She felt it then, the presence, the feeling of being watched, and in the depths of the fog, she saw something she couldn't explain. A figure, shrouded in mist, standing at the ruins of the chapel. At first, it seemed like an illusion, a trick of the light. But as she watched, the figure moved, slowly, deliberately, toward her. The fog parted briefly, revealing the woman's face as pale, lifeless, with eyes that glowed faintly in the dark. It was Thomasina, or what was left of her. "Leave this place," the figure whispered, its voice cold and hollow. "It is too late for you." Dr. Cross recoiled, but the figure was gone, swallowed by the fog once more. She didn't tell her team what she had seen. She didn't want to admit the fear that had crept into her heart, but deep down, she knew the truth. There was something here, something far older than she had ever imagined. The next day, one of the researchers, a young man named Samuel, vanished. His tent was empty, his equipment untouched. The others searched for him, calling his name, but the fog was thick, impenetrable. It swallowed their voices and their footsteps, and as they wandered deeper into the town, the silence grew heavier. They found him days later, lying motionless at the base of the cliffs, his eyes wide open, filled with terror. But there was something else. The fog had settled around him, thick and suffocating, as though it had claimed him as its own. The marks on his body were unnatural, as though the earth itself had reached up to pull him down. Dr. Cross knew then that they were not dealing with a simple ghost story. The curse of Widow's Peak was real, and whatever had happened to Thomasina, to the others who had vanished before her, was happening again. With Samuel's body returned to camp, the team debated their next move, but there was no real decision to be made. They were too far in now. The fog had claimed them, and there was no turning back. As night fell again, the remaining researchers gathered around their campfire, their faces drawn and pale. They had heard it before, the whispers, the footsteps in the fog, the distant echoes of a voice long buried. But tonight, it was different. The fog was closing in, suffocating, and the whispers were growing louder, more insistent. Dr. Cross tried to maintain control, but the fear in her team was palpable. "We're almost there," she whispered, though she wasn't sure who she was trying to convince. "We need to finish what we started." But the fog was closing in too fast. One by one, the researchers disappeared. They were swallowed by the fog, their cries for help muffled, as if the very land had devoured them. Dr. Cross found herself alone, the last of her team, standing on the edge of the ruins, staring into the endless, swirling mist. And there, in the distance, she saw the figure again. This time, the woman did not vanish. She walked toward Dr. Cross, her eyes glowing faintly, her face expressionless. The fog parted as she approached, revealing the full form of Thomasina. "You should have left," Thomasina's voice echoed, now more like the voice of the land itself, the voice of the entity. "You should never have come." Dr. Cross felt the weight of the words pressing down on her, felt the chill of the fog seeping into her very soul. The ground beneath her feet trembled, the earth groaning, as though something deep below was stirring. In that moment, she understood. Widow's Peak was not just a place, it was a prison, a burial ground for something ancient and malevolent, and it had never been truly sealed. The ritual that Thomasina had performed all those years ago had not banished the entity. It had only bound it in the land, in the fog, in the very soil of the town. And now, it was awake again, hungrier than ever. Dr. Cross turned to run, but the fog closed in around her, the whispers drowning out her thoughts. The last thing she heard before the darkness claimed her was Thomasina's voice, cold and final. "You cannot escape." And just like that, she was gone. When the authorities arrived weeks later, they found nothing but the wreckage of a forgotten camp. There were no bodies, no traces of the researchers who had vanished. The fog had cleared, but the remnants of their presence lingered: photographs, journals, and broken equipment scattered like breadcrumbs leading into the mist. No one would speak of Glenmere again. The town remained abandoned, its history buried beneath the weight of time and fog. But the fog was still there. It always would be. And as long as Widow's Peak stood silent, the whispers of the past would never truly die. They would only wait, watching, waiting for the next curious soul foolish enough to seek the truth.